You're listening to The South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast by Ohio State fans for Ohio State fans on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and SoundCloud. Welcome back to The South Stands, everyone from San Francisco. I'm your host, Zach Moore. Today is Sunday, September 20th, and I am very happy to be joined by fellow South Stands contributor, my good buddy, Tim Gallagher from Connecticut. Mr. Gallagher, how are you today?
Doing well. Buckeye football's back on, so I'm feeling good.
All right. Good to be with you, man. Good to be with you. Thanks for making the time. So this past Wednesday, as you've referenced, first-year Big Ten Commissioner Kevin Warren emerged battered and bruised, but still in one piece from a 36-day media hailstorm, bearing a freshly minted return-to-play plan for football in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic. On a Zoom call with reporters aired by the Big Ten Network on Wednesday morning, Warren and 5 representatives of his Return to Competition Task Force unveiled an 8+1 schedule beginning October 24th and ending with what Barry Alvarez, the chair of the Task Force Scheduling Subcommittee, referred to as Champions Week. That's December 18th and 19th. Now, that final weekend of Big Ten play will feature a title game, of course, between the East and West Division champions, as well as crossover matchups between the teams finishing 2nd through 7th in each division. So, for example, second place team in the East will play the second place team in the West. Third place in the East plays the third place in the West, and so on and so forth. The Big Ten champion, assuming it's done enough to impress the College Football Playoff Committee, of course, we're hoping that's going to be Ohio State, will have just under 2 weeks to prepare for a national semifinal game on January 1st. Now, we also know what Ohio State's revised schedule is going to look like. That was revealed yesterday, Saturday, on Fox's Big Noon Kick pregame show. We're going to get into that in a minute. But I will say, a little preview, if you like cupcakes and you're a Buckeye fan, you're going to love this new schedule. Okay, so Tim, before we get into all that stuff, when last we spoke on August 12th, this was the day after the Big Ten's announcement to postpone fall sports, you and I were in lockstep. You and I both felt that the Big Ten had made the right call. So my first question to you is, since that day, the 12th, and between the 12th and the announcement this past Wednesday, did you find your feelings over the decision changing at all? Did you find yourself maybe thinking the Big Ten should have, responded differently?
So it's a really interesting question because if you think back, my point back then was, and still is, that universities are not in the business of assessing risk with people's lives. Mm-hmm. And to me, that made perfect sense then why they decided to cancel the season. And I still think that that's the case. And so for me, what must have happened is that the Big Ten, the presidents, and then the medical board and the other people involved in this decision must have come to a conclusion over the course of the last month plus, that whether it's via testing, whether it is what they've seen in practices, what they've seen in some games that have happened so far, there must be enough evidence out there that they now believe that they can conduct games in a safe manner. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have that confidence a month ago. And so I think that if that's the case, then I think it's totally fair. And I think it must be, because I also just don't believe that some of these presidents are going to take the risk, regardless of sort of how much pressure there is to play football. So I don't know what the evidence is, but my assumption, and it may be wrong, but my assumption is that the presidents have been presented with evidence that convinced them to change their mind. And they were presented with evidence that they believe reduces the risk down to a point of where they're not putting kids' lives at risk. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the change that must have gone on over the last month. Now, I'll give full credit to Paige, who said this from the beginning, which is, in retrospect, do I look back on it and think, maybe canceling the season in August was a bit of an overstep, and why cancel it? Why not just postpone?
Right.
Why not, punt until you get more information and you do more work and you actually see what's happening. And I do agree with that now in retrospect. I think that the Big Ten may have just gone a little bit too far, and they would have been better served to just say, hey, we're not comfortable right now, so we're going to postpone. And you can continue to postpone until there's no season. So canceling it seemed to be, at this point, a bit harsh. And obviously the backlash was pretty big by a lot of different people.
Yes, it was.
And so, I think that's the only thing that I, sort of, when I look back on, maybe question as to what could have been done better at that point in time.
That makes sense. And if you're in that camp, our good buddy Page's camp, that the Big Ten could have waited, kick the can down the road, as they say, that's a reasonable position to take, in my opinion. I believe it was also our good friend Page who said he was still holding out hope, even then, that there would be football in the fall. I think he said he was the last guy standing at the bar waiting for the lights to go off. And it turns out he was somewhat prophetic with that statement as well. So I'll give Page credit there as well. Well, the linchpin of this plan, and you had referenced a new comfort level that the presidents have with this plan. The linchpin, of course, is the advent of rapid daily testing, which started to emerge in around late August. There were several rapid daily testing options that began to emerge. If you look at some of these, as we turn our focus now to the actual plan, two things that stood out to me when the plan was announced: the shutdown thresholds, as I call them. The first is a mere 5% team infection rate will trigger a 1-week pause in team activities. And then the second, any player testing positive will not be cleared to return for at least 21 days. Those are very punitive, I guess, for lack of a better word, shutdown thresholds. And I think what the Big Ten has done there, and tell me if you agree with this, I think the Big Ten has said, hey, look, we'll go along with this. We're gonna give this another go. But they are putting the onus on these programs and on the players individually for strictly adhering to these protocols. There's zero margin for error here, zero margin for carelessness. Like, for example, what we've seen at LSU or Texas Tech, where they've done absolutely nothing to mitigate the transmission of the virus. And basically both teams, the entire rosters have already been infected. I think the Big Ten is clearly not comfortable with that sort of thing. I think the threshold for them, the goal for them, is still mitigating transmission as few people as possible. They're not comfortable, in other words, with kids getting infected, even though, as we know, there's a very low risk of serious medical complications in many, many cases with these young men. To me, the Big Ten is still saying, we're going to give this a go, but we don't want people getting infected. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that that's right. I think there's a couple other things at play too. I think one is, if you're the Big Ten and you're gonna, for lack of a better term, flip-flop here and go from season canceled to, okay, we're gonna open back up again, I think you have to put something out like this. Right. I think you have to say that we're going to take a very conservative approach to what we're going to allow. And that makes sense. And so that didn't surprise me. What I also believe about this topic, though, is I believe that over time, the standard can change and may very well change. As they get more comfortable, fingers crossed, with teams playing, and hopefully the statistics are good and transmission rates are zero or close to zero and kids aren't getting affected by it. I think that you could see them, potentially relax that, later in the season as you're getting closer to the end. I mean, right. It's a moving target, right? The Big Ten has the standard and other conferences don't. And, they could adjust it over time. Because I do agree with you, 5% and anybody testing positive sitting out for 3 weeks, well, that's half the season at this point. So, those are low bars for sure.
Yeah. What also stood out to me was and I was actually happy to see this. And again, this could be something that could be relaxed as the season goes along, but no fans allowed at games. And with that measure, I think the Big Ten has also taken widespread community transmission into account by, in my opinion, wisely choosing not to sponsor super spreader events at its stadiums this fall. Unlike the SEC, right, who's going to attempt to bring up upwards of 20 to 25,000 fans together on their campuses for games. And on campuses, by the way, where transmission is already very high. Again, this could be a standard that could be relaxed, but I thought the Big Ten is doing the responsible thing with respect to community transmission, not just student athlete transmission. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's wise to start off with no fans in the stadium, although I think it's going to be super interesting. I mean, I know that they're not allowing tailgating outside either, but
right.
okay, fine. Off of the actual stadium grounds, just think about it at Ohio State. You're going to have the varsity club packed, the Blackwell's going to be packed, all the tailgates that go on, not on the grounds of the stadium are going to continue to happen. So, I don't know that you're going to have much luck not getting people together, but look, you'll be outside and it'll be, the chance for transmission will certainly be less. But I do think it makes sense. I mean, and in theory, I also think it makes sense to have 20 or 25,000 people at a stadium that's the size of Ohio State. But the problem is just getting in and out.
Right.
Like you can spread people out among, around the stadium and have it be perfectly fine. And you're not, within 10 rows of somebody, but when it's time to leave, you're all going through the same entrances and exits. And,
right.
That's a little bit more challenging to control. You can tell people you got to wear a mask when you're coming and going, but,
right.
It's a little bit harder to control that. And so therefore, again, I think it's perfectly acceptable to let's play a few games. Let's see how it goes. Let's see how this is all going. And if things are looking up, then, we can adjust.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as well. I did have some, you had mentioned gathering outside of the campus's jurisdiction where they can enforce people, not gathering in large groups. But as you say, Ohio State, Columbus, it's a big city. What's to stop folks from gathering in mass at private residences, bars, restaurants, that sort of thing? I think Ohio State has taken some responsibility on itself to try and mitigate those kinds of gatherings to the extent it possibly can by not allowing fans to gather in its stadiums. There's less of a chance that happens if you're not inviting 25,000 fans inside your stadium. Although, again, people are going to gather at watch parties and things like that to watch it on TV. So, then the other factor too is look, let's face it. You and I very well know, having been overserved at many Ohio State games ourselves, when people start drinking, there's a certain percentage of folks that just aren't going to follow the rules. My question is, if they were to allow 20 to 25,000 fans in the stadium, the ushers, the folks that usually are helping people to the seats, I mean, those, if I'm not mistaken, those are like retirees, folks volunteering their time. They're not, in other words, like security. But if you're going to have that many fans in the stands, I think you've got to have some muscle in the stands to enforce people, especially people who've been drinking, to keep from gathering in clusters and groups. And in any case, I do think, it's good they're starting out with no fans. Let's see how it goes. Maybe this is something that can also be relaxed as the season goes along.
And by the way, you're 100% right. The people taking your ticket at the entranceway, the people who are kind of standing around helping you find your seat and things like that are, generally, retirees and people who are just, wanting to be around the game and pitching in and helping. They're definitely not security and not the right people to, sort of be monitoring that, okay, in the South stands, let's say if a bunch of kids are spread out, but, over the course of a game, all of a sudden there's a cluster of them together and, half of them don't have masks on. How do you patrol that?
Right.
And that definitely is needed if you're going to try and let 25,000 people in.
Yeah. And we've already seen it, right? We saw it last week at the Florida State game where there were large clusters of people gathered, together, not wearing masks and, drinking and that sort of thing. So, well, good. All right. Well, look, I'm perfectly happy with these games being televised. The other thought I had is with no crowd in the stands, how could Fox, for instance, enhance its television coverage? Maybe you can bring in extra cameras, angles we're not able to see typically because there are fans in the stands. Maybe that'll allow the television coverage of these games to be enhanced in a way that could make it really enjoyable.
That's an interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, you all of a sudden now you can be in a lot more places,
right?
With cameras and other things. But yeah, that would certainly be an advantage if you could do it.
Let me ask you this. Were there any other factors in your opinion that changed the course of this decision that forced them to, as you say, flip-flop? And what do you think those were?
There's been a lot of speculation about, the media pressure and the parents' pressure that they were applying who wanted their kids to play. And I just don't know that I buy that. I really don't. So I think I read something too about how, the president of the University of Michigan, who I think was somebody who was pretty staunchly against playing, just couldn't, there's so many other fires going on campus, and he was distracted and focused on those things. And then people were pushing back on football, that he just sort of acquiesced to the pressure. And I just don't know that I buy that.
Right.
I truly think that, and we don't know because we weren't in the room, but I truly think that it came down to, the medical staff, going over new protocols and new information, and presented it in such a way that it became, I don't want to say worth it, because that's not it, but it became doable.
Right.
It became that, the risk equation shifted to where it's like, okay, we can at least give this a shot and see what happens. And we feel good that, we've got enough triggers to close it down if things go sideways without, doing kids undue harm.
Right.
That, I think fundamentally, that is at the core of the decision.
I would agree with that. The Justin Fields petition was a nice story because I think that's a young man who's starting to find his voice and emerge as a leader. I thought that was a nice story, but I didn't think a petition was going to change anything. I didn't think the grousing from fan sites and angry fans on Twitter was going to have any real impact. I didn't think the parent-player protests at the empty Big Ten offices was going to have much of an impact at all. I don't think that's the type of thing that changes the minds of universities, chancellors, and presidents that are faced with such a serious, grave decision, right, that impacts so many lives. And it also involves a lot of money. I agree with you. I felt like it was things like the advent of rapid daily testing, a greater comfort, more information around the myocarditis condition. They definitely reached a comfort level on that sort of thing. There's this coalition now of Ohio State and Nebraska fans on Twitter, this partnership, because they're crediting Nebraska with that player lawsuit as having had an impact here, which I just don't buy. I know it was that forced the Big Ten to reveal some documents, revealed the vote, but in the end, I didn't really think that suit had much merit. And it really was kind of the new medical information that the presidents and chancellors were operating with that really made the difference.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all that. I think the last thing I would say on that topic is, I think that the criticism that Kevin Warren has gotten, I think some of it is fair and some of it is unfair. Mm-hmm. I think if you're going to make a decision of this magnitude, I think you got to at least come out afterwards and stand there and answer questions.
I agree.
I'm not one who believes that the public gets to know everything.
I'm with you.
And so what goes on behind closed doors goes on behind closed doors, and the people that have been put, in the power to make those decisions get to make them without having the press and the media and, the fans and everybody else, the parents all over them while they're making the decision. Mm-hmm. But I think that once you make a decision of this magnitude, you got to come out and face the music and talk about it. And again, it's up to you what you ultimately say and don't say, and how disclosive you are as to the deliberating that went on and how the decision was made and all that. But I think you gotta get out there and talk to people. And I think, to me, that was the real mistake. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the decision. It wasn't however they came to their original decision. It wasn't any of that. Again, I think in retrospect, you could play armchair quarterback and say they should have punted and and not made this decision to cancel the season. It's like my issue isn't even with that, because as they've done, you can always change your mind. My decision was, you don't make a decision of this magnitude and then say nothing about it.
Right.
Right. And that just fed the whole fervor of the media and the parents and the players and everything. Is just, there was nothing, right? It was like, we made this decision and yeah, you guys all got to live with it. And look, it's a tough decision, but like, you got to stand there and face the music.
Right.
And so I don't know who made that decision that nobody was going to say anything, but to me, you're right. It didn't help anything, and it just made it worse.
Yeah. And, Warren should have, on the interview he did with Dave Revson of the Big Ten Network on August 11th, it was a disaster. I think we both agree on that. I don't think he should have been alone there. I think it should have been exactly like the Zoom call that happened on Wednesday morning, just this past Wednesday morning, when they were explaining the rollout, the new plan for the updated season in the fall. You have not just Kevin Warren there, you have a medical expert. Maybe you have several other administrators, somebody representing the presidents and chancellors, an athletic director. It really should have been, in my opinion, more of a panel than just Warren sitting out there all alone, because it wasn't his decision to make alone. It was ultimately the decision of the presidents and chancellors. Now, I will say, he's been lambasted, and he's gotten his fair share of the criticism for the way that it was handled. Warren has. But I feel like he deserves a little bit of credit now for the way things have ended up now that the Big Ten is returning to play in October. Because I think very soon after that decision was made, well, in retrospect, you could tell that he had learned from his mistakes. One of the big criticisms he had gotten was that he had failed to coalesce all the key stakeholders in making this big decision. There were reports that he was speaking separately to the presidents and chancellors and the athletic directors, and didn't really bring them all together in making this huge decision. Well, shortly after the Big Ten announced that it was postponing, and that whole disastrous press conference on the Big Ten Network, Warren put together this return to competition task force that had no less than 46 key stakeholders from around the Big Ten universities. We're talking chancellors and presidents. We're talking athletic directors and coaches. To me, that said that he had learned from his mistakes, or those reported mistakes, that he failed to bring everybody together to make this decision. So I think he deserves a little credit for this outcome and bringing all those key stakeholders together. There were subcommittees that represented health and safety and those protocols, as well as scheduling and television. And I think the plan that they rolled out on Wednesday was actually pretty impressive, right? It's pretty intriguing. We're going to get that 8+1 schedule. I really like that Champions Week idea that they've come up with. And they wasted no time getting back into the conversation on football Saturdays, releasing the new schedule yesterday on Fox Big Noon Kicks pregame show. So I'm going to give Warren a little bit. First, I'm going to cut him a little bit of a break. He's a first-year commissioner dealing with the biggest crisis in conference history. He clearly had some flubs, but I think when he was given a second opportunity to get it right, it seems to me he did a pretty darn good job, and I'm going to give him a little bit of credit there.
Yeah, very, very fair. Totally agree. And also very much agree with your point that when you're going to cancel the season, you don't have the Big Ten commissioner, who, as you rightly pointed out, wasn't even his decision, right, go out there by himself, and make this and do this press conference and make this announcement. So completely agree with all that. I completely agree that, he probably deserves a lot more credit than he's getting for where the Big Ten is at this point. Right. But I don't think you can. I also don't think you can have this conversation about what has gone on in college football without noting just the complete and total abject failure of the NCAA as a governing body once again. How do you not get the commissioners of all of college football together and go, guys, let's have one plan. Let's figure it out. Mm-hmm. You need to go back and talk to all your presidents. Let's do it, but let's have some consistency here. Yeah. In terms of timing, in terms of announcements, in terms of what we want, in terms of different conferences want different things, that's fine. But like some level of consistency across college football. And there was nothing. As far as I can tell, the NCAA has once again been completely devoid of anything having to do with this situation. And so you just ask yourself, Why does it exist?
Yeah.
Why? And what good is it doing? Mark Emmert, like whatever that guy makes a year, if he makes $10, it's $10 too much. That guy should be fired.
I totally agree with you there. I think, yeah, well, once major college football removed the NCAA from its playoff, that basically took the teeth out of the NCAA. But I'm with you. Maybe that's a podcast for another day. They kind of sat on the sidelines there while, guys like Warren and the university presidents of the Big Ten and, were taking all the fire and trying to figure this out on their own and making decisions independent of one another. If you're talking about the five FBS conferences, it was a mess, and it's been a mess. And actually, if you look at the schools that are pressing on right now, it hasn't been pretty, right? We've got 15 game postponements or cancellations already. We're hearing stories of kind of rampant outbreaks on within programs, lots of player opt-outs. It's been a bit of a mess. It could have been done a lot cleaner, that's for sure. I don't know how close we are to having some new single governing body. Maybe you have more insight than I do on that, but again, maybe a podcast for another day.
It is a podcast for another day. And I think that's exactly what it needed. It needed some leadership here across all of college football. And we just didn't get anything from the NCAA. So, and that's very typical of the NCAA. So again, I asked the question, why do we have it? Why do we need it? If you're not going to step up during an episode like this and provide leadership, then what's your point? Then why do you exist?
Really good question. All right, Mr. Gallagher, yesterday on Fox's Big Noon Kick, the new schedule was revealed, and I'm sitting here looking at Ohio State's schedule right now. 8 scheduled games. There'll be a +1 at the very end, which we hope is going to be a Big Ten championship game. Ohio State's 4th in 4 years. That remains to be seen. Now, Paige and I have already done 2 separate game-by-game schedule breakdown podcasts. I'm not going to ask you to do that with me today. We've already kind of got that covered. What I would like you to think about as I go down the schedule, I want you to come up with your one concernometer score for the entire season. That is the question, what is your level of concern that Ohio State can navigate this schedule I'm about to reveal undefeated? Ohio State opens the season October the 24th at home against Nebraska, who was utterly punished by the Big Ten schedule makers, by the way. October 31st at Penn State. Now that's notable. Pretty big game, only week 2. Ohio State's still working out the kinks. November 7th, home against Rutgers. November 14th at Maryland. We're looking at another Rutgers-Maryland back-to-back this season. Last year it was reverse Maryland-Rutgers. 2 snoozer games, November 7th, November 14th. Although Talia Tagovailoa from Maryland, their quarterback, was granted immediate eligibility. So I don't know, maybe he can make Maryland a little bit more of a threat in that game. November the 21st, Indiana at home. Indiana's played us pretty competitively over the years, the last 7-8 years. November 28th at Illinois. December 5th at Michigan State. And then December 12th, the regular season finale, Michigan comes to the shoe. December 19th would be the Big Ten title game. Before we dive into this schedule, Tim, give me your concernometer score.
It's pretty low. I'm not that concerned about it. I think that there are some games on here, obviously, like at Penn State that you look at and say, all right, that's not an easy game. It's not nearly the game it would be if there were fans in the stadium.
Right.
But still, you got to go to Happy Valley and beat a very good James Franklin team, at home. Mm-hmm. So I'd say it's like a 3.
3. Okay. That's my exact score as well. 3. Not having to face the whiteout at Penn State. The other thing is the crossover games. Ohio State was supposed to have Iowa in the previous 2 iterations of this schedule. Iowa's played us very tough through the regular season under Kirk Ferentz. That's a pretty big subtraction from this schedule. And instead, you get Nebraska, who you beat up on perennially. And then your other crossover game is at Illinois, which in Champaign can be a bit of a tricky game, especially late November. Those winds get swirling. It's kind of a wind tunnel there. You could force you to be one-dimensional. At Illinois, Lovie Smith's done a decent job there. I don't know, maybe no crowd, especially if it's a sleepy kind of like 11 a.m. Central kick. Maybe there's some some upset potential there, but I'm reaching now at this stage. You've got two games right here, Michigan and Penn State. Really, those are your two kind of linchpin games for this schedule. I guess maybe if you're looking at the SEC playing a full 10-game conference slate, Ohio State's got to look good. They have to look good. They can't afford any sleepy, underwhelming performances on this schedule when you've got the SEC, and we know how the playoff committee tends to give the SEC the benefit of the doubt. You've got to look impressive in virtually every week here, and you've got to win going away. But I'm with you. My Concernometer score, 3 for this one. I think Ohio State can navigate this schedule pretty easily. This looks like as much of a cupcake schedule as you could possibly get in the Big Ten. I like Ohio State going undefeated and getting into the Big Ten title game, and then we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are, look, I think it is an easy schedule for somebody in the Big Ten East. I just don't think it's as big of a cupcake schedule as some people.
Okay.
Look, Nebraska's on the rise. Frost is a good coach. I don't think that's going to continue to be the cupcake that it has been. They're going to continue to get better. Penn State's a bit of always a dogfight.
Always.
I agree with you. The middle of the next couple games should be sleepers. Indiana does always play us tough, but it's at home, and by that time, the offense and the defense should be fully rolling. So I don't think that's really a challenge. Sort of the same with Illinois, although I agree with you. It's a weird time to be in Champaign. Lovey, Brandon Peters, who has played well for Illinois, transferring from Michigan. And then I don't know how Ohio State always ends up with this, right? But how many years in a row now have they played Michigan State, then Michigan, Penn State, then Michigan? Like we always seem to have a couple of tough games right at the end. And I don't know what to make of Michigan State. I don't know what Mel Tucker, can do up there in one sort of shortened, crazy season. But I know that they've got athletes, and I know that they have toughness, and they weren't who they usually are under D'Antonio the last couple of years.
Right.
But he may be able to get more out of that team than D'Antonio was getting the last couple of years. So you just kind of look at it, and it's like, there's definitely some easy games in here, but you can also make some arguments that there could be a few tough ones. And so I don't think it's a hard schedule, but I don't think it's a cupcake schedule.
The Illinois matchup for me, in the first two iterations of this schedule, when Paige and I went over the schedule, I had actually earmarked that as a mild upset alert for Ohio State because it's in Champaign, because of historically playing in that stadium, what that has been like for quality Ohio State teams. I don't have the numbers here in front of me, but some really good Ohio State teams have gone into that stadium and barely lived to tell about it. The 2006 Ohio State team that played in the national championship game, that was a very tight game. I remember it was also played in late November in lousy weather. That right off the top of my head. I think also 2010 with that Terrell Pryor team that lost only once. That team went into Illinois, and it was a very tight game, and they weren't able to put the game away in the last 2 minutes. And I think Smith has done some good things there. I like Brandon Peters as a quarterback, as you've mentioned him already. They're coming off last season, that big upset win over Wisconsin. I think they had another big comeback win on the road against Michigan State last year as well. They came back from like a 24-point deficit in that game. They also had a big comeback against Michigan, which fell short. So that's a game to watch out for. I agree. And Mel Tucker, the only thing about Michigan State I would otherwise agree with you is not only are they looking at a coaching change, they're replacing Brian Lewerke. Their defense is absolutely gutted with all their playmakers at every level. I don't have all the losses here in front of me. So that to me, it feels like there might be a little too much for Michigan State to overcome, but the game's being played December 5th. They'll have some time to work out some kinks. It's a game they always seem to get up for. Then we get Michigan in the shoe. You know how I feel about the Michigan rivalry. I need to see something on the field to believe that this is going to turn back into a rivalry again. This game's in the shoe. Michigan hasn't won there in 20 years, but I tend to think Ohio State should be able to win that game going away. Michigan's also replacing, I think, 4 or 5 starters on the offensive line, some playmakers at wide receiver. Donovan Peoples-Jones, for instance. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, overall concern-o-meter for me, 3. I like our chances, but would not be surprised if there's a pitfall or two Ohio State's going to have to navigate.
Yeah, the only other thing I would mention is, the Illinois game, as you pointed out, there's a whole bunch of things there. But the other thing is that that's typically the Michigan weekend, and
right.
It's Thanksgiving.
Oh, right.
And so, are you distracted over Thanksgiving and other things going on that weekend? And then you've got to go to sleepy Champaign. And as you said, it's late November, it's windy, it's this, it's that, Illinois comes up with a big game, and you're right. I don't really like that game very much at all.
Yeah.
And then the Michigan game, what can you say? I agree with you totally. Until I see something on the field, I just don't think they have a chance. The only thing I'll say about that game is that the one thing that they will have going for them in that game is that there will not be 110,000 crazy people in the stands.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's actually going to help them.
Right. That's a good point.
I don't know if it's going to help them enough, but I think it's going to help them. And I also think Dylan McCaffrey's out, but who's the new quarterback that's starting this year?
It's so funny. I was just going to ask you the same question because his name escapes me. We saw a little preview of him in the 2018 game. He came in at garbage time, threw a touchdown. He also threw an interception. Let me look him up real quick. Joe Milton.
Yes, Milton. Yes, Joe Milton. But I actually think he's good. He's big. He reminds me of Jalen Hurts.
Yeah.
Big, strong, can run, has a cannon. Obviously haven't seen him play a lot, and so don't know how good he really is at the position.
Right.
But I think he looks to be a pretty solid quarterback.
I like that comparison. On Fox's Big Noon Kick yesterday, Urban Meyer and the guys were talking about Milton, and Meyer even went so far as to compare him to Cam Newton, just in terms of his physique. He's a big dude, like 6'5". And who knows? He might be just the panacea for what's ailed that Michigan offense against Ohio State, a big athletic quarterback who's a threat to run. I was also looking at another game on this schedule, which I've now forgotten, but Indiana was also a game that I had put Ohio State on upset alert. And it was because of Michael Penix Jr., that dual threat quarterback we didn't have to face last year. Now, I feel like I've been talking so much about Penix Jr. that I've turned him into like Michael Vick. But because Indiana has played us so tough over the last 7 or 8 years, we are returning a young secondary. And we'll get into position battles in our next pod as we start hearing about those battles coming out of practice. I'm really looking forward to getting into that with you, Tim. But Ohio State is returning a mostly young secondary, save for Shaun Wade. It's fairly early in the schedule, about midway through the schedule. Does a quarterback like Michael Penix Jr. or even Brandon Peters the following week against Illinois, do they have enough to victimize a relatively inexperienced secondary? Cam Brown, Sevyn Banks, Josh Proctor. We'll see. But those are games I would pay attention to. And if you're from the outside looking in, you're not very familiar with Big Ten football, or you're not long in the tooth like we are, and remember what some of these rivalries have been like, what some of these, these matchups within the conference have been over the years, you're probably dismissing those games. But I tend to agree with you now. I think you've convinced me there are some potential pitfalls in this schedule, and it isn't exactly the cakewalk that it appears to be. Well,
and also, here's the other dynamic, right, is that when you play a 13, 14 game schedule, the way it's typically gone, right, is you start off with some cupcakes, and maybe you've got the tough game in there of Oregon or something like that. But for the most part, you're giving yourself a couple games of warm up, which is allowing new players to get their feet wet. If you're going to play a game like Oregon early in the season, you can also suffer a loss. And still potentially get yourself in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. Ryan Day is facing neither of those realities. He's facing a reality where players have to be ready to go game one. Every game matters, and you have to go undefeated. If you lose a single game, you're out. And so there is no, hey, let's get our feet wet and let's get some of these new starters tuned up on, Bowling Green or whoever.
Right.
They're stepping in day one to Nebraska and game 2, they're going right into Penn State. So it really changes the dynamic of the schedule.
It does.
Or the schedule changes the dynamic of the team, I guess is really what it is just that there are no cupcakes. Probably won't be too many, games where they're playing half the game or only, 2 quarters or something.
Right.
It really is where you've got to perform and you've got to go undefeated. Yeah. And so that's a different mentality. Not that Ohio State ever banks on being able to lose a game, but you do sort of know, like it is almost like we are starting halfway through the season where, okay, if you start 6-0, at that point, okay, I can't lose another game the rest of the season because the late loss kills you. And we're starting the season that way. And that is the whole season.
I was just thinking about something that Urban Meyer said yesterday on Big Noon Kick, which was if you're a coach, you're not going to have those early games, those early cupcake non-conference games to play younger players and build out your depth. You're going to have to rely on your veteran players, probably a little bit more than you want to through most of this schedule. You may not have some of the depth you would otherwise have toward the end of the season. I thought that was a really interesting point that he made there.
It's very true. Everyone's going to get a little bit less playing time, unless Ohio State gets up big in a few of these games, and then they can get some of these guys in.
Yeah. Do you think they make it through this 8 day? I'm not concerned about Ohio State, by the way. I feel like I would be stunned if there was a 1-week shutdown at any point during the season, or if any key players are shut down for 3 weeks because of infection. I don't know about some of their opponents, though. So my question is, do you think they get through this 8-game schedule, or do you think there'll be a cancellation or two because of one of their opponents not being able to make it through unscathed with the coronavirus?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's 50-50. I think clearly of all the teams in the Big Ten, Ohio State has the most to play for. And I think you'll see the seriousness out of programs like Michigan, like Penn State, probably like Wisconsin. But, do some of these other programs who, aren't really vying for a national championship or to go to the playoffs or to go to a big bowl game if they have them, are all of those players, all 85 of those players, really going to take it as seriously? Probably not.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I'm looking at that Michigan State game on the 5th. Normally, a game you have to respect, but new coach, new roster, and a lot of key positions. If you're, 1-6 by December 5th, how many of those players, as you say, are taking it seriously? Do we see a slip up and all of a sudden that game doesn't happen? Now, does it matter if that game doesn't happen? If you get through Penn State and Michigan, you look impressive in doing it, and then you face a Wisconsin or Iowa, win impressively in the Big Ten title game, a postponement like that probably isn't going to hurt you. So, and as you say, the Penn States, the Michigans, whoever they face in the Big Ten title game are a good bet to take the protocols as seriously as Ohio State. So maybe it's not that big of a deal if they have 1 or 2 cancellations. It's going to be a very interesting playoff debate, isn't it? I mean, I think probably the most hotly debated playoff that we're maybe ever going to see.
It is. And it really is going to be interesting because this could be the first time in a long time that we actually have seen a number of teams go undefeated. I mean, imagine you've got maybe 5 or 6 teams that are undefeated.
Right.
How do you resolve that? And one team's played 9 games and the other team's played 6. Mm-hmm. It's going to probably be, very frustrating for a lot of fans. But it usually works itself out, which is how we all sort of get there with the process. But this year it may not, and it is going to come down to a bit more of a subjective decision by certain people,
right?
Which is always rife for argument. But look, the other thing about the schedule that I'll say that I actually think I like is, I think every year we sort of lament the fact that, Ohio State really ends its season the first weekend of December, with the Big Ten championship game. And then it's got, 3+ weeks before it plays again. I actually think the schedule plays into the Big Ten's hands a little bit, and that the 2 weeks are perfect.
I agree.
Allows guys to get healthy. You're still sharp after the Big Ten championship game, but gives you a little bit of rest. And then you're into the playoffs. I actually think that is a better schedule than ending early and sitting around for 3 or 4 weeks.
I'm totally with you. The other thing is it could be a test case for the eventual 8-game playoff, where one would think if the field does expand to 8, you're going to utilize those 3 or 4 weeks between championship week and bowl, season to add, extra playoff games. So this should be a good test case for that. I've always hated the 3 or 4 or 5. I mean, back in 2006, we sat almost 7 weeks between the end of the Michigan game and the national championship game when we got housed by Florida. I've never really liked that big long delay, and it didn't seem that there was any reason for it. I guess maybe the kids are having finals, so you forget they're students, and finals are happening during that period somewhere around there. So that's something they'll have to navigate. But it seems to me that that's something that could easily be worked around.
I am hopeful that if Ohio State makes it, that will actually be something in its advantage to be a little sharper at that point in the season.
I'm with you there. Yeah, I'm with you there. And hey, I welcome the playoff debate. I mean, considering where we were just a week ago, not even sure that the Ohio State was going to play and that they would even be in the playoff discussion. Give me that debate all day long. I'm here for it. I'm happy that Ohio State's going to be in it.
It's great to have Ohio State football back, but it's, again, kind of getting back to what we first talked about. I'm hanging my hat on the fact that the people that needed to, mainly the medical people, did their work and they figured out how to do this safely. And if that's the case, then everybody wins. We get football and the kids are safe.
100% in agreement with you. All right, Tim. Well, hey, thanks again for making the time. It was great to be with you today, and we'll speak again in about a week.
Sounds good.
All right, buddy. Take care. You've been listening to the South Stands, a Buckeye football podcast. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and visit our website at southstandsosu.com.